Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be painting a grapefruit, first in gouache and then in oil using this photo that I took as a reference. I'm also using an Arteza mixed media pad and Arteza paints for this painting, which they sent in exchange for an honest review. This is the gouache set that they sent me. It's an insane amount of paint, but also I know that gouache can be finicky when it comes to mixing matching colors, so I figure the more colors, the easier it's going to be for me to match in the long run. I will say that this mixed media pad doesn't have as thick of paper as I usually like to use. It's 110-pound paper, but I usually prefer around 180 for mixed media projects. But this has a lot of paper in it, so I'll definitely be using it for future studies and sketches. Like Arteza's acrylic paints, their gouache is a light fastness rating of 3, which means that the paint isn't very resistant to fading when exposed to light. But if you're like me and just want to play around with it, or you're just starting out and want a beginner's set, these are definitely a good option. There's a good variety of greens, blues, reds, and neutrals, and they have a number of pearlescent colors, which will be fun to play around with for accents. While I was swatching these colors, I ran into a somewhat life-changing discovery. This peach red. It's so vibrant that it challenged everything I thought about oil paints. I didn't even know where to start to mix a color like that, but we'll get more into that journey later on. My first order of business before starting this painting was to play around with the colors and figure out which mixes would work best for the painting. I knew I wanted to use that peach red color because it was so incredibly vibrant, but I wasn't sure if I wanted it quite as pink, so I decided to add a couple different oranges to it, which made it into more of a vibrant red. I also tried adding a darker red to it, and then some yellow, and later on some purple for the shadows. In the end, I decided that the colors I'd be using were titanium white, lemon yellow, saffron orange, orange red, scarlet red, peach red, lilac, and violet. I'd only painted with gouache a few times before this, so it was definitely a learning experience trying to figure out the best way to go about laying down the paint. My sister actually paints with gouache quite a bit though, so luckily she'd given me a couple tips, and I knew I wouldn't be able to layer as easily as I would with oil, especially if I was using more water in later layers, because then I would end up picking up underlying paint. So I started by laying in the lighter colored background with more water and painted around where I thought the shadows and the grapefruit would go so that the white paint wouldn't mix in with the darker or more vibrant colors. Next I started laying in a thin layer of darker red and orange to where I planned to put the shadow and the darkest part of the grapefruit. I was still using a lot of water for this layer because I didn't want the paint to get too opaque, especially in the parts of the grapefruit that the sun was shining through. And then I started adding yellow to the edges where the grapefruit slice was a bit thinner. And here I'm slowly building up the darker sections of the grapefruit with a darker red color. Still not too dark because there's no really coming back from a dark color once you put it down with gouache, unless you cover it with a really thick layer of paint. I realize it's not exactly the shape of the grapefruit in the picture, and I wish I had made it a little rounder now looking back at it, but whatever, it's not a big deal. I also kind of wish I had used a bit more blue in the shadows and the dark part of the grapefruit skin, just to really make the vibrancy of the red stand out and make it a little glowy, but you live and you learn. That's one thing I like about taking videos of my painting process. I watch them back and realize mistakes I made and different things that I maybe want to try in the future. One of the problems with gouache is that the light colors often become darker when they dry and the dark tones become lighter when they dry, so it's really hard to match colors once you've lost the original color that you put down. Here's an example of how I was trying to mix colors to be able to match and blend into the shadow color and it drying and ending up not being the color I originally mixed. I tried to blend it in a bit more by adding more water and mixing what was already on the paper, but it just wouldn't work the way I wanted it to. Peeling tape off a painting, on the other hand, is one of the most satisfying feelings. Here's the end result of the gouache painting. I'm pretty happy with it, although now that I'm a little more familiar with gouache, I see things that I would change or add. But I'm looking at this as more of a study to get used to the gouache process and techniques, so maybe I'll try to go a little more wild with a recreation in the future. Now time for the oil painting. These are the colors I decided to use at first, but I did end up adding a few more later in my effort to recreate that peach red that I was raving about earlier. So I was really sad because my phone camera stopped recording and didn't capture most of the beginning of this oil painting process, but it really looked a lot like the start of the gouache painting, although in the background I used a few different shades of white using the yellow and the alizarin crimson, which mixed in from the first layer of paint that I put down. Hopefully the rest of the process will show you kind of what the beginning would have looked like, especially because I repeat the same techniques a lot and just keep building up the paint. I tried to make a pink in the beginning, but I had so much trouble recreating that peach red that I just ended up using the cadmium red light because it was the most vibrant color that I had available. A key difference in how I worked with gouache versus oil is how I dealt with the highlights. For gouache, I had to be very careful where I put my paint and avoid the areas that I wanted to be the brightest points, particularly with the darker colors. But with oil paint, I can lay down the midtones or the average values of each area, then slowly build the highlights up. It's almost like sculpting. I've always liked working this way because building in the highlights rather than laying down shadows is more of an intuitive process for me. Also, with oil, I'm able to blend lighter tones into darker tones that I've already laid down, which was really hard to do with gouache since the paints wouldn't blend together easily and they would dry a lighter color than I'd expect. At this point, I thought I was maybe done, but something was still missing. I tried to add some splatter effects in the hopes that it would help me feel satisfied, but it still didn't work for me. There wasn't enough glow, that peach red was still haunting me, and I needed to know if there was any way to recreate it in oil. So I searched online, bought a couple different oil colors that I hoped would help me in my quest, and waited for them to arrive. First, I tried mixing Quinacridone Magenta with yellow and white, since magenta seemed to be a common recommendation for a bright pink, and I wanted it to be a bit brighter. No such luck. So I went back to the cadmium red again to make it more vibrant. Next, Pink Matter by Holbein seemed like another paint that might work. It was almost like a jelly texture and it was pretty transparent. Mixing it with the titanium white made it more opaque, but it was still very similar to mixing Quinacridone Magenta with titanium white, and it didn't compare to the peach red. It was still a very cool tone, so again I ended up adding red. Michael Harding's Brilliant Pink was another recommended pink that I found. It's actually a mix of Naphthol Red, Quinacridone Magenta, and Titanium White, so you can actually try mixing this yourself if you have those colors already. But with more professional quality paints like Michael Harding, there's generally more pigment than mid-range paints. I added some yellow, which made it look a lot like the mix of the pink matter that I made, then added some red as well. I think this did end up being the brightest of the bunch, but it still wasn't as bright as the peach red. Here you can see all the mixes beside each other. They're all very similar, but unfortunately none live up to the vibrancy and opaqueness of the gouache. And as soon as I added it to the painting, I knew it was too blue and too dark. I couldn't simply add more white to lighten it because that would desaturate the color, so again I ended up mixing more cadmium red light into it. But the more paint I tried to add, the darker it got. I think my first mistake was maybe putting down that first layer of alizarin crimson where the grapefruit was going to be. I think I should have left the area completely white and used a thin layer of the pink colors that I mixed, or just a thin layer of the cadmium red to make a more vibrant look. Mixing more white into the color just made it more desaturated and less vibrant, whereas layering it over a white base like a glaze would make it brighter. I don't know if that makes any sense, but the more paint I add, the darker and harder it is to come back to the brilliance of the first layers. So after that rather disappointing end to trying to find a vibrant pink, I decided to move on to plan B, which is to add a cooler, darker tone to the painting to make the grapefruit seem brighter. I used King's Blue, Cerulean Blue, and a bit of red and yellow to create a more neutral, cool tone for the shadow. I was at first tempted to leave this painting as is because I was scared of ruining it, but I reminded myself that you have to take risks sometimes. If I'm not happy with a painting, would I rather leave it be and always be unhappy with it and wonder what it would have looked like if I actually did take that risk? Or would I rather try something, risk ruining it, and then learn a valuable lesson? Obviously, I went with the latter. At this stage, the paint in the background was dry, so I didn't have to worry about it mixing in with new paint. I made the edges of the shadow warmer to create a more glowy look, and then swiped a large brush over it to make it almost like a sun ray type of effect. And of course I added more splatters because they're just really fun. I decided I wanted the shadow to be a bit closer to the grapefruit so that it would make it pop a bit more, so I moved it up and repeated the same steps and used a dry brush to blur out the edges. Now that since I used so much red and yellow in this grapefruit that it looks more like an orange now, but honestly I'm okay with that since oranges are also delicious. Now time to varnish. I'm using a retouching varnish to make the colors pop and even out the finish. Retouching varnishes can be used once the paint is dry to the touch, unlike regular varnishes that you have to wait months before you can use. I know a lot of oil painters watch my videos, so I am begging you, if you know of a really bright pink, like the peach red gouache, I would love to know what it is. Please tell me your secrets. Anyways, this is where I left it. As always, I'm continually finding things that I would change now, like making the shadow under the grapefruit a little more blue to match the background. And of course, trying not to add as much paint to the more transparent parts of the grapefruit so as not to lose the brilliance of those first layers. Other than that though, I'm pretty happy with it. I really like all the textures and colors that were involved and how it evolved in general. I think I learned a lot from this and it makes me happy. And a little hungry.